sun's coming up, my drink is hot, now it's time for our first cup. Today, immigration. As someone who has lived in border states my entire life, I've come to appreciate that immigration is like a rose. What do I mean? Well, think of a rose bush, right? The roses, the blooms, they're the most colorful part of the bush. They're the most obvious part of the bush. And in fact, they're the part that most people focus on. But those roses are fed by a complex system of branches and roots and fertilizer and water. Whole 9 yards. All of that kind of comes together in one very visible flower. I think immigration, a lot of times the way we talk about it like it's only the rose and not the roots. Got an example, comes from mid-90s Phoenix, Arizona. Because in the mid to late 90s, there was a construction boom in Phoenix. There was a lot of demand for housing, and that meant that there was a lot of demand for contractors, people who could build houses and do things related to building houses, like install HVAC systems, air conditioning systems, and the ductwork in the whole 9 yards. And this boom was so big that everyone was trying to get a piece of it. It wasn't just like the major home builders and the big companies, even small shops like my dad, 2 to 4 man shops, depending on the time of year, in my dad's case, were even putting in bids on some of these subdevelopments, right? Because there was just so much work that nobody saw how it could get done without like everyone getting a piece of it, to be honest. Like that's how massive the growth was. So my dad and a bunch of other shops like his, they were all putting in. Morning, guys. They were all putting in. And not a single one of those small shops got any of the work 99% of the time. This didn't seem logical. My dad, a bunch of these other small shop owners wanted to figure out what the hell was going on. Because the work was getting done, but it wasn't getting done by any of these small or even a lot of the mid-sized shops. Well, Dan Angel's head of a pin, whatever. Anyway, so my dad and a few other guys, they'd take some time when they had a minute. They were doing a job out near these, new subdevelopments. They'd drive through. They're like, all right, what can we see? Who's doing what? And a lot of them saw the same thing. They saw installation vehicles, trucks, etc., just white. No logos on them anywhere. No logos, no license number, no nothing. No contact information, nothing. And when they looked at the people doing the work, the people didn't really look familiar. No one really recognized any of the guys doing the work. And everyone who was doing the work spoke Spanish. Now, this caused a bit of a ruckus in the HVAC industry in the mid to late 90s in Phoenix, Arizona. It wasn't that it was rare to see people speaking Spanish, especially Mexican idiomatic Spanish. Like that was super common, right? It's that all of this work was being done by only these guys. Something didn't smell right. And although it would take many years to uncover, my dad and everyone else who thought that something was awry, they were correct, right? As it turns out, a lot of these guys who were doing the work had been brought in by coyotes, human smugglers. And the companies that had gotten the bids for the work had paid these human smugglers to bring the contractors across the border. And what's more, these companies often only existed for a summer or two, as long as the contract that they got existed. They were essentially shells. Shell companies hire human traffickers to bring in cheap labor, and nobody who's in the domestic market who really could use that work or need that work even had a fair shot at that work, because as it turns out, those guys who were on the job sites were getting paid, somewhere between 20 and 33% of what you would pay a tech, even on a job at that scale. But those guys that were visible, that were audible, speaking Spanish, they were the roses. And that's a shame, right? Because in this entire sort of scheme, which, by the way, was viable 25 years ago, it's still happening today in almost exactly the same way. Do not kid yourself. The border is more secure, but good old entrepreneurial ingenuity finds a way. But going back to what my dad and his cohort uncovered, interestingly enough, I think the guys that were doing the work, who were undocumented, were the most American people out of the entire enterprise. They were the ones who were literally risking themselves to better themselves, their families, and their communities. Right? And when you think about the risk in this situation, really, who took most of the risk here, right? It was the guys doing the work. Even politically, right? An immigration raid makes the news and makes for much bigger headlines than the IRS or the State Department of Labor raiding an office building for a company that hasn't even been around for a year. And all that supporting stuff, the supply chain, if you will. Whoever put together those shell companies and then thought to hire the human smugglers and then enacted it all and bid on the contracts, that's the branches, that's the roots, that's the fertilizer, that's the water. The guys doing the work are just the visible part. And even though that's just one story about immigration, it's not the only one like it. And in fact, especially in an election year, if you're being told to only look at one particular facet of an issue or of a problem, there's probably 5 or 6 other things that you're not being asked to consider. There's 5 or 6 other things that are feeding into that issue that have a lot more to do with the issue than the easily visible part. And if we are going to live in the best version of this country, of this society that we can live in, we need to be willing to look at those branches, at those roots, at that fertilizer, at that water. Because you're only looking at the roses, you're not getting to the root of the problem. And as it is with Immigration. So it is with many of the complex issues that we face. That's why we got to take the time like this. But please remember that no matter what you've heard or what I've said, death comes for us all, and a closed mouth never gets fed. Take care of yourselves. Make a plan to vote. We'll speak again soon.